Happy New Year, guys. Happy 2024. I hope you all had a wonderful start to your year so far. The start to my year has been very average. I chilled so much over Christmas, like literally last year, like 2022 Christmas, we ended up booking ourselves in for like social things, family things every single day and like the break between Christmas and New Year. And this year we were like, no, we are not doing that. We are sitting at home. So that is what we did. I sat at home for a whole week. I did nothing except plan. I'm a big planner. I fall hook, line, and sinker for the whole like New Year, new me thing every single year. But you know what? That's going to work out really well for you guys because I spent the entire time planning what I want to do with this channel. I have big plans for this channel. I have big dreams. We're going to see what I can actually achieve this year, but I really just want to be able to put more time and effort into this. I really enjoy the little community that we fostered here. I really enjoy having a space where I can talk about the books I love, particularly queer books. I really want to fill that niche online by talking about queer books, sapphic books mostly, like self-admittedly I do mostly read sapphic, but just queer books in general. There's really not that many people on the internet talking about LGBTQ plus books, and I want to be that person. I've decided I'm going to do it. We are going to do great things on this channel. But anyway, this video isn't about 2024. This video is about 2023 and all of the books that I read in 2023. I'm actually just going to move myself to this side so when I'm editing I can have all the books appear here like that. That's not very aesthetic, is it? Let's just put away some of these papers. The worst book is not going to be a surprise to anyone. It's November 9 by Colleen Hoover. Colleen Hoover loves writing about these abusive, misogynistic, awful men and then pretending they're God's gift to earth and to women. Ben, the sort of like romantic lead in this book, is abusive. He is controlling. This isn't a story about abuse. It's not a story about how to spot the warning signs of abuse. This is supposed to be romance. Like, women are supposed to be fawning all over Ben. This entire book was red flag after red flag, and then you go on Goodreads and it's just person after person rating it 5 stars, saying how wonderful Ben as a character is. I am concerned. Straight women, you deserve better. Colleen Hoover does not write good romance. Her men are awful. Number 59 is Find Me by Andre Asselman. This is the sequel to Call Me By Your Name, and if you liked Call Me By Your Name, do not read this book. Like, this destroyed every single character that I previously loved. It features yet more concerning age gap romances. Like, Andre Asselman heard the criticism of Call Me By Your Name and just decided to double down on all of it out of pure spite. This is a book not written for fans of Call Me By Your Name. I don't know who it's written for, but it's not us. I'm a Fan by Sheena Patel. I just can't get on board with this one. I cannot understand the rave reviews of this book. In this one, you're in the mind of a narrator who's obsessed with the man she's in love with and the woman that she's obsessed with, who is the man's current lover, if I remember correctly. None of these main characters are named at all. It's just the man she's in love with and the woman she's obsessed with. And to me, this book was just mindless rambling with no discernible plot. Like, I've seen people describing it as self-aware, but to me it felt like the opposite. This was a narrator with zero self-awareness. Like, I don't mind a book where the protagonist is supposed to be unlikable, but it just felt like a lot of words to say absolutely nothing, for nothing to happen in this book at all. I feel like there could have been a really interesting commentary in there about race and misogyny and mental illness and social media, but instead it was just sort of lost under endless whinging. I really did not like it. Number 57 is The Twyford Code by Janice Hallett. I love the appeal by the same author, so I was so excited to read this. And that just goes to show you should never trust anyone. In this, you follow Steve as he tries to find out what happened to a school teacher who went missing decades beforehand. And this book is all told through audio transcriptions, meaning there's a lot of room for sort of error. Words aren't always what they seem. It's a really fun premise, but the book is just really dull. I got so bored and I fought through to the end because I wanted to see what happened, and then it was just a really dull conclusion. I just didn't like it. Ugly Love by Colleen Hoover, another massive Colleen Hoover fail. Now, this one isn't quite as blatant as November 9 and is a few books higher because credit where credit is due, the storyline did keep me turning the pages, but this is just yet another awful male where abuse is masquerading as romance. I mean, Colleen Hoover's writing style is incredibly simplistic and it's really easy to read, which I think is why her book's so popular. But if you look any further than that, it's just really concerning. I'm not going to talk too much about this one because I do have a review of this coming up soon, but it wasn't good. Into the Water by Paula Hawkins. I was very intrigued to read this because I found Girl on the Train by the same author to be just like distinctly okay. And I wondered if this one would be any better, but it was just so dull. This is a town in which multiple women over the years have died in the local water. It's nicknamed the Drowning Pool, and all of the women sort of seem to be connected. They have very similar stories, but like, are they connected? This book has got this massive cast of characters, each chapter switches point of view, and it's just so overwhelming. I didn't care for any of them, and overall it was just a really boring story. There was no suspense. Girl A by Abigail Dean. I think a huge part of my issue with this book was the marketing. I think if this had been sort of like marketed to me correctly, I might have enjoyed it, but I just wasn't in the headspace for something so heavy and slow at the time I read this. I thought this was going to be a mystery thriller, a psychological thriller, like a mystery to unfold kind of vibe. But it's really, really not. Like, this feels like a really real and true and painful story. This is the story of Lex Gracie. She saved her siblings' lives when she escaped from their sort of house of horrors. She had an evangelical nutjob of a father holding the family captive. The narrative jumps between the modern day and her childhood. It is incredibly clearly inspired by the Turpin family, and it was just so dark. Like, I know thrillers are supposed to be dark, but this wasn't thrilling. It wasn't like a page turner. It was just a really difficult read, and it shouldn't be marketed as such. The Spanish Love Deception by Elena Armas. This is an adult straight romance in which I felt basically zero chemistry between the love interests. You've got Catalina, who needs a date to her sister's wedding because, God forbid, she goes alone in a world in which a woman's only value is the men they are dating. And so she ends up going with her work rival Aaron, who is a man who has no discernible personality, and his only notable trait is his very blue eyes. Like, literally, his super blue eyes are mentioned at least once a page. This is somehow an enemies to lovers story with zero communication. You and Me on Vacation by Emily Henry. I will admit, I didn't actually hate the plot of this one too much. In this, you have Alex and Poppy. They've been best friends since college, and every single year they go on this big holiday adventure together. Until one year something happens which means they stop talking and the tradition just ends. Fast forward to now, and they end up going on one last trip just for sort of like old time's sake. The vast majority of this book sort of alludes to something happening on that last holiday which caused them to fall out, and then the twist happens, and obviously it's that they hooked up and things went wrong from there. Like, that is so obvious from the get-go that I didn't realise that was gonna sort of like be the twist in it, because obviously that's what happened. Like, why else would a woman and a male character fall out in a romance book? Like, obviously they hooked up, but they sort of like build you up to this like big twist with all this suspense, like what happened between them? And they just kissed. Actually, I think it was more than kissed. I can't remember. I've sort of blocked it from my memory, but Like, as far as romance books go, like, it was fine. Like, it wasn't damaging in any way, but I did have to knock it points because Emily Henry spends this entire book telling you how much Poppy and Alex see each other as siblings, whilst also trying to convince you they've got this huge romantic chemistry and they're going to end up together. It was just a bit gross. News from the Dead by Mary Hooper. I am very surprised this one is so far down the list because I actually didn't hate this, but when I sort of looked to move it further up the list, it just wasn't better than anything else that I'd read. This is a look at the story of Anne Green, a girl who was hanged many centuries ago for infanticide, and hours later she miraculously came back to life. From a sort of like history nerd perspective, this one was really interesting, but the writing just wasn't that captivating, and it was just a bit slow. There was a lot of unnecessary chapters about another character who added very little to the story. I didn't hate it by any means, I just didn't love it. But if you're intrigued by the story of Anne Green, I did make a video on my main channel about her, so maybe you can go and watch that. Number 50 is Solitaire by Alice Oseman. Now, do not go into this book thinking this is going to be a light, happy read like Heartstopper just because it's the same author, because it is not. plot. This is the story of Tori Spring, as in Heartstopper's Charlie's older sister. Tori's going through some pretty dark shit, and then she meets a boy, and things go a little bit batshit crazy from there. This book does preface with some trigger warnings, so you kind of know going into it that it's going to be dark, but I do feel like a lot of it was kind of gratuitous, especially the ending. I do love Alice Oseman though, so do not think this is a slight on them as an author. This was just their first book, I think, and it does show. Sometimes I Lie by Alice Feeney. I'm not going to lie to you, I can't really remember the plot of this book. I was going to look it up for this review, and then I was like, the fact I can't remember it probably says all you need to know. Something about a coma and a character who's caught herself in a web of lies, I think, but other than that, I don't really have much. I don't remember outright hating it though, so there is that. Like, I thought it was alright. Watching You by Lisa Jewell. Now, I usually love Lisa Jewell's writing, so I was quite disappointed by this one, but at the same time, like, I didn't hate it. It was just, we're very much coming into the mid-tier meh portion of this video. Like, all the books I were like, they're alright, didn't love them, didn't hate them. This is a multiple perspective story in which you open with somebody being dead, and then you switch between point of views each chapter as you slowly piece together what happened and who's responsible and who's dead and all that. You start off with hating certain characters, being sure that they're the bad guys, and then you see like the other side of the story, like you see their point of view and you realise how easy it is to miscommunicate. This is a really interesting look at perspectives about how everyone has a different side of the story, and I do think Lisa Jewell did that really, really well, but the storyline as a whole was just a bit average. Mangoes and Mistletoe by Adriana Herrera. This is a very cutesy little sapphic romance book that I read just before Christmas. It's a short story about two Dominican women who get cast in a baking reality show that they have to go to Edinburgh to film. From the get-go, they had this amazing chemistry, and the spice in this book is really top tier, it's great. But the rest of the writing did leave something to be desired. I felt like this needed another edit, or maybe even 5. There were some glaring mistakes in the writing of this book, but it was really cute. Bunny by Mona Awad. I read this book back in the summer, and this was a chore to get through. It is magical realism, and magical realism just really isn't my vibe. I generally like books set in the real world, and I really struggled with a lack of explanation as to what the fuck was going on in this book. I just really struggled to connect with it, which I think is quite a common critique of this story. People either love it or they absolutely hate it. It is just absolutely batshit cuckoo crazy. But what I will say about this book, because I've thought about it almost every single day since I finished reading it, so take from that what you will. She is a Haunting by Trang Tan Tran. I picked this book up because it was marketed as sapphic, and I will consume pretty much any media with gay characters, when in reality I probably should have left this one on the shelf because it's also marketed as horror. And much like magical realism, me and horror do not mix. Jade, our main character in this, is Vietnamese American with an estranged father, and she ends up travelling to Vietnam to spend the summer with her father under the guise of him giving her college money. Only very strange things start happening in the house that he's renovating and they're all staying in. Only it's just really boring. Like, even the horror in this wasn't that horror-y. A lot of it was body horror, which just made me feel weird. I think this is supposed to have a lot of like symbolism that maybe I just didn't really pick up on. It's a really interesting look at culture and colonialism, connecting with your roots. But that was kind of the most interesting part of this one. And the queer relationship in this is so much of a side story that it was kind of almost barely worth being in it. Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo. It pains me to put this one so low because I know people love this book and I also loved it, but only half of it. In Girl, Woman, Other, you have 12 short stories about 12 different women, mostly black women. You get to know them, you learn their stories, their past, their upbringings, how their experiences have shaped who they are today. And then it ends and you just move on to the next. I just felt like it was so abrupt. Some of the stories I'd really get into, I'd really fall in love with the characters, only for it to end too early. Others I ended up just skimming through because I didn't really care for the characters. I think had the stories of 6 women been explored much deeper instead of 12, I think I probably would have loved this, but that isn't what the book was. However, I will say I did love how all the stories sort of like came together in the end though. It was really cleverly done. Misogynation by Laura Bates, the first non-fiction entry on this list of many. I've listened to so many non-fiction books on Audible this year, and after listening to Men Who Hate Women by Laura Bates, which I'll be talking about later, I was really excited to see sort of like what else Laura Bates had written, and I picked this one because it was short. It's a collection of essays about the sort of deeply ingrained misogyny in society. But I just felt like, once again, some of the essays were a bit too short. They'd failed to really sort of like get into the details and the meat of the issue, whilst others were a bit too long and rambly. This is older now, so I think a big problem with it is it's just a bit outdated. Most of the essays were dated sort of like 2014 to 2016, and the world has obviously changed a lot since then. So it's not necessarily a criticism of the book itself. I just think if you want to dive into misogyny and feminism, Laura Bates has much better and more up-to-date books. Sorry Bro by Taline Voskouni is an adult sapphic romance featuring an Armenian-American woman who's trying to embrace who she is, trying to sort of like come to terms with her culture and her bisexuality, whilst her mum is trying to set her up with multiple different men. This was just very much okay. I absolutely adored learning about Armenian culture. It's just not something I would have learned about otherwise, but generally I just didn't really care for the romance in this book. The characters make some stupid decisions with very little reasoning behind them. It is literally the definition of things just happening for the plot. Unwell Women by Eleanor Cleghorn is another non-fiction looking at how the patriarchy has affected women's medical care all throughout history, like right up until today. How these sort of like unconscious biases are still held by so many. I found this one really fascinating, but obviously this is just such a broad topic to cover that I felt like all the information was just a bit jammed in. It could have done with a little bit more focus. I did really like this. It just could have been 3 separate books, and I feel like I would have absolutely adored all of them. Never Ever Getting Back Together by Sophie Gonzalez is a YA sapphic romance in which a number of women appear on a reality TV show in which a man brings all of his exes into one house and sort of like pits them against each other so one of them can win him back. He is the ultimate prize. Only, of course, 2 of the exes, Maya and Sky, end up falling for each other instead. A really fascinating premise, but I really struggled to feel any chemistry between these 2 characters, and their romance just seems to kind of come out of nowhere. It needed more. This Delicious Death by Kayla Cottingham is a queer dystopian in a world in which a virus known as the Hollowing has caused people to crave human flesh. But luckily, there's a synthetic version of human meat to curb those cravings, and life goes on as normal. But then a group of friends goes to a music festival and one of them ends up killing and eating a boy after being drugged. Again, it's a really interesting premise, but I just didn't care too much for the characters, nor did I really care for the plot. I was much more interested in hearing more about the Hollowing itself and the virus, but that never really comes. Read Between the Lines by Rachel Lacey is a very standard adult sapphic romance, like nothing to shout from the rooftops about, but also nothing particularly bad. There's just better books out there. In this, you have a bookshop owner whose building is being torn down by a property development company, and the owner and the property developer fall in love. Classic. Page Boy by Elliot Page is his memoir about being trans in Hollywood and how that's affected his career and life. It's a look at gender, love, mental health and relationships. It's told through a non-linear timeline, so it sort of jumps back and forwards a lot, which makes it a little bit difficult to follow, especially when you're listening to the audiobook like I did. It also felt a bit surface level. It really could have delved a lot deeper. A lot of very interesting statements were made and then just like not followed up on at all. It doesn't go any deeper. It really was interesting. I enjoyed learning about Elliot's life, but it could have been better. 29 Seconds by T.M. Logan is a really thrilling thriller, and I actually think it's the first of a couple of T.M. Logan books on this list. A woman basically saves the life of a young girl who turns out to be the daughter of this like mafia boss type guy. So he owes the main character a favour and he says he'll make anyone that she wants to just disappear. She ends up naming a person to disappear against a better judgment, and then lots happens. It is truly really heart pumping. She Drives Me Crazy by Kelly Quinlan. I love me a sporty gal sapphic romance. This one is YA with the star basketball player Scotty ending up getting into a car crash with cheerleader Irene, and so they're forced to share lifts to school and a very unlikely romance forms. It was just really cute. After Love by Tanya Byrne is a truly heartbreaking love story between 2 teenage girls, Ash and Poppy, set in my favourite place in the UK, in Brighton. And then Ash suddenly ends up dying on New Year's Eve, and she becomes a Reaper, responsible for collecting the dead across the city and helping them transport to the other side. But all Ash wants is to be reunited with Poppy. This book made me cry so much. I really just don't deal with death very well. It was so sad, so touching, but it was a lot. We Should All Be Feminist by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie is an essay about feminism from an author who lives between the USA and Nigeria. It's a look at what feminism means in each country and what that means for her and all women. It was really interesting, but very similar to Misogynation. It did feel a tad outdated, having been published in 2012. But I think for like a dummy's guide to feminism, it would be so interesting. Icebreaker by Hannah Grace. Yes, I am shocked that this one is so high on the list as well, but what can I say? This was a cute straight romance in which I didn't actively hate the male love interest, and that rarity deserves some applause. Anastasia is an ice skater, Nathan or Nate is an ice hockey player. There's like this natural rivalry between them, but then Anastasia realises that Nate is actually quite a decent guy. This book, be warned, is about 40% sex scenes, but the storyline like around the sex scenes is quite cute, but also it could have been about 100 pages shorter. Some Girls Do by Jennifer Dugan, a YA contemporary queer romance about an openly gay track star falling for a closeted beauty queen. This is a lovely slow burn full of teenage angst. I really like the characters and I definitely want to read more by this author. Fresh by Margot Wood. I have genuinely never read a book like this and I doubt I ever will again. It's a really fresh, funnily enough, modern twist on the college experience. We have Elliot, who's a sex-positive bisexual girl sleeping her way around college and documenting her experiences. Elliot is just all round this hot mess, but a really lovable character. This book breaks the fourth wall constantly with all these different footnotes. Elliot talks directly to you, the reader, but it also has some very cringy language, shall we say, that made my insides shrivel up, so it did lose a star on that alone. Cultish by Amanda Montell is a non-fiction book about the language of fanaticism. Amanda Montell explores the languages used not only by cults but also by businesses, people, Jonestown Scientology, Peloton, social media influencers. It is so fascinating and a really interesting listen. I absolutely devoured it. Ophelia After All by Raquel Marie is just the loveliest YA sapphic romance with the most beautiful cover I've ever seen. Ophelia has always been known as that like boy mad girl, but then what happens one day when she realises she's got a crush on a girl? It sort of throws everything she knows about herself into question. How does she figure out who she really is? I just adored this book. It was so cute. Girls Like Girls by Hayley Kiyoko. This is one for all of us millennial gay girls. Hayley Kiyoko wrote a fiction book about the characters who feature in her Girls Like Girls music video, Coley and Sonia. I do think I'm biased in my enjoyment of this book, as Girls Like Girls the music video was such a pivotal moment in my life in a time when there was literally zero sapphic representation out there, but I just adored reading this book. It felt very nostalgic and comforting. It's not the best written thing you're ever going to read, but it got points just for being what it was. One by One by Ruth Ware. It is no secret that I love a Ruth Ware book, and this one was no exception. She is just the queen of the murder mystery, her and Lucy Foley. This one is set in a ski chalet up in the mountains. A tech company are there on their company retreat. There's an avalanche that blocks them all in, and then one by one, people are being murdered. Despite the fact that halfway through the book it becomes abundantly clear there's only one viable suspect for the murderer, it somehow still managed to keep me really hooked. Lies by T.M. Logan, another T.M. Logan thriller. A man sees his wife driving into a hotel car park when she's supposed to be at work and he becomes suspicious, so he follows her. He subsequently watches her have a fight with one of their family friends and he is just very intrigued. From there, things get wild when he starts receiving very threatening texts. I was a bit worried at the beginning of this one that it was going to be a bit convoluted, I suppose, but I actually really zoomed through this. It kept me turning every page. I really liked it. Mistakes Were Made by Mira Wilsner is a spicy adult sapphic book featuring an age gap couple. College student Cassie goes to a bar to blow off steam and meets a very attractive older woman called Erin, and they end up hooking up in her car. All of that happens in like the first chapter. It's very intense. Only it turns out afterwards that Erin is the mother of Cassie's best friend, come to visit her at college. It is not for everyone. I must admit that I'm not really one for age gap relationships myself, but regardless, I did really like the story and the characters. The Falling in Love montage by Kira Smith. I love Kira Smith as an author. This is the second book I've read by her, and I just adored them both. Saoirse is a teenager with a really, really difficult home life who's not looking for a relationship at all. She can't do it right now. She doesn't have the time. But then she meets Ruby, who's leaving at the end of the summer. So they come up with a kind of loophole. Let's live this summer like we're living in a romantic comedy. Let's hit all the tropes. And it was just adorable. It was so much fun, and I loved grumpy little Saoirse with all of my heart. In My Dreams I Hold a Knife by Ashley Winstead. A group of friends are rocks when a member of their group is murdered in college, but everyone thinks they know exactly who did it. But fast forward 10 years and it's time for a college reunion, sort of shoving everyone back into their old habits, and this time they're gonna find out exactly what happened. I loved how Ashley Winstead sort of like slowly dropped hints throughout this book, which made it possible for you, the reader, to solve the mystery, but not just because of lazy writing. Like, you can't solve it because it's obvious, you solve it because she's purposefully leaving hints. Every Time You Hear That Song by Jenna Voris. Full disclosure, I did receive an ARC copy of this, and it's not being released until April of this year, but just let me fill you with a bit of anticipation because I really enjoyed this. This is a dual timeline story. You've got the story of singer Declan and her lover McKinley back in the 70s. It shows the slow burn of their relationship. And then today, in the modern day, you've got the story of superfan Darren after the death of Declan. It turns out Declan left a time capsule scavenger hunt after her death, with the prize being money and brand new music. So Darren goes on a search to find it. This wasn't a perfect book by any means, but I did really like it. I will recommend it to anyone looking for some cute sapphic fiction. It kind of reminded me a bit of Daisy Jones, a bit of Seven Husbands, a bit of Dumpling. Really good. Diket by Jenny Fran Davis. This is a bit of a curveball because this is an absolutely insane bit of contemporary fiction, focusing on main character Sasha and her truly unhealthy relationship with both her partner and everyone else around her. This is high femme butch representation. Nothing in this book happens like you'd expect. Being in Sasha's head is a complete mindfuck as a reader, and yet I really, really enjoyed it. I have never read anything else like this, but I do think it would send a straight person into a coma. The Love Hypothesis by Ali Hazelwood. Am I insane putting this book so high up? Probably. But again, I just really enjoyed it. This book is cheesy and it's stupid, but it's so self-aware that you can't help enjoy it. And the grumpy sunshine trope is just, it's always going to get me bad. The sex scenes in this book are truly god-awful, but the plot is great. Just read around the sex. What Lies Between Us by John Mars. When people talk about page turners, this book is what they mean. Like, it literally pained me to put this book down whilst I was reading it. In this one, you have a truly twisted mother-daughter relationship in which each chapter switches between their points of view. Each character manipulates you as the reader to the point that you have no idea what's going on. You don't know who's in the right, who's in the bad, who's the bad guy, who's in the wrong, and who's not. The only thing that let me down with this book was the ending, which I felt like was a bit of a cop-out, but that is a personal opinion. The rest of it was fantastic. Spare by Prince Harry. Do I really need to elaborate on this one? Probably not. I am unapologetically team Harry and Meghan. Always have been, always will be. I love them. Through my job, I know too well the toxicity of the British tabloid media, and I pity anyone who becomes a victim of them, and also who becomes a victim of just the monarchy in general. Like, the royal family, they're fascinating, but let's not pretend they're all good people. Let's not. I'm also just a wildly nosy person who has to know every detail about everything all the time, and I know one of the main criticisms of this book was the length of it, how it needed editing down a little bit, but honestly, this could have been double the length and it still wouldn't have been long enough for me. Like, I devoured this. Also, I listened to the audiobook, which always helps. I do find with memoirs that listening to the author narrator themselves just adds this whole other layer. It Happened One Summer by Tessa Bailey. I spent the entire first half of this book commenting to my fiance just how much the plot and the characters reminded me of Alexis and Mutt from Schitt's Creek. And then I turned to the back page and I realised it literally says on the back that it was inspired by Schitt's Creek. So maybe I'm biased, but it is one of my favourite TV shows ever. Anything inspired by Schitt's Creek has got the thumbs up from me. In this book, we have a wealthy LA socialite who's forced by her stepfather to move to the small fishing town where she was born to sort of like reconnect with herself and the meaning of money. And then from there, she meets a man. Iris Kelly Doesn't Date by Ashley Herring Blake, the third and final instalment in the Bright Falls series, and it didn't disappoint. I love these characters. I love how intricately Ashley Herring Blake builds them up and builds the world up. I love how these sapphic relationships feel so true, so real in this series. I'm just gonna miss Bright Falls so much. Hot Shot by Claire Lydon, an adult sapphic football romance. Really, truly a bit of me. I really enjoyed this one. We have American football player Sloane coming over to play in the WSL here in the UK to escape a failed relationship, and she very quickly falls for the new performance coach, who I think is called Ellie. This is a wonderful slow burn. Some of the obstacles they come up against are a little bit silly, but I think I'm able to overlook anything for female footballers. I really enjoyed it. Also, for anyone who cares, any other football lesbians out there, I was in London at the weekend. I was walking through Knightsbridge, and who walks past me? Lucy Bronze. Lucy Bronze walks past me, as in my number one hall pass, the person who I would cheat on my fiance with like that. It's not even cheating. Holly tells me I can. She was like, just like, do it. If you ever meet Lucy Bronze, you have my full permission. We walked past Lucy Bronze, and I didn't realise, like, it didn't register until it was too late, and then it was so busy, like it was so crowded, and then she was walking away and I was stood there like dumbfounded, and I was like, shit, that's Lucy Bronze. And I was like, I could chase after her, but A, that's weird, and B, when I like go up to her, what do you say? Like, what do I say? I fancy you? Do you want to go on a date with me? I will leave my fiance for you. Like, you can't say any of those things, so I just sort of like let her go. I don't really regret it, because like, what would I have said? She also walked past me and didn't immediately fall in love. Like, I looked good, she saw me, she didn't stop and ask my number on the street. So maybe that's my answer. But you know what true love is? The fact that Holly was with me and Holly was like, run after her, go. I didn't. I didn't. But moving on, we have Men Who Hate Women by Laura Bates. This is a truly disturbing look into incel culture, how extreme misogyny affects all of us, men and women alike, written by women's rights activist Laura Bates. And she actually manages to infiltrate these incel communities to really get to the bottom of what the hell is going on. This book terrified the absolute shit out of me, but I do think it should be required reading for everyone. Along a very similar vein, we have Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez, which is a look at data bias in a world designed for men by men, how it affects women all around the world. This is incredibly data heavy, which I personally really liked. The amount of chapters in this book that I reference in daily conversation with people, like particularly men, is absolutely wild. Like, there's a chapter in this about infrastructure, about how towns are designed for men with roads for cars rather than roads for buses and other public transport, which would benefit women much more deeply because many more men have cars than women do. If a couple household, like a male and female couple household, has a car, men are more likely to take that to work, leaving the women at home with no transport, so they rely on buses. There's another chapter about public toilets, about why there are always queues outside women's toilets but never men. It shouldn't just be put down to women being slow and stupid. It's because women have to deal with periods and children. The fact that more urinals can be fit into a space than full toilet cubicles. Like, if you want true equality in this area, women's bathrooms should actually be larger than men's. Is so interesting. I could speak about it forever. I recommend it to everyone. A Good Girl's Guide to Murder by Holly Black. This one gets so much hype, of which it is totally deserving. A YA murder mystery in which school student Pip has to write a report for school, and she decides to focus on an old murder from her town. Everyone thinks they know what happened in this murder case, but Pip is determined to find out for 100% certainty. This one will very much keep you on your toes. I did come up with my own theory about a quarter of the way through, and that just happened to be right, but I was never quite 100% sure. It was always throwing curveballs out at me. This was just fantastic for anyone wanting to get into this genre, whether you're a teenager or an adult. Number 10 is Don't Let Her Stay by Nicola Sanders. Oh my god, what a thriller this one is. Reading this had my heart beating out of my chest. I've never actually had to put a book down before and walk away because the suspense is too much, but this one I couldn't. I had to just leave it for a bit. One thing I will say is the main character in this one does kind of suck a bit. Like, she's a bit of a wet blanket, which was frustrating. But for whatever reason, I don't mind disliking a character in a thriller as much as I do in like a romance or contemporary book. Like, you kind of go into thrillers, into mysteries, knowing that there are going to be bad people in it. Cleat Cute by Mira Wilsner, another lesbian football romance. I adored the characters in this. Like, you have experienced footballer Grace, who's been on the New Orleans and USA national team for years, and then you've got newcomer Phoebe, who comes in and just completely shakes everything up. Grace is just a little bit grumpy and she's very set in her ways. Phoebe is ADHD as hell. And I think a really big part of why I enjoyed this one so much, because it really reminded me of me and my fiance. Me being the grumpy one, her being so ADHD. This book wasted no time in getting to the spice, and it's Mira Wilsner, so you know there's going to be spice. But the actual romance between the characters is just this like delicious slow burn. I just love this. The Lesbiana's Guide to Catholic School by Sonora Reyes is just the most wonderful sapphic YA book I have ever read. This has so many layers, I just don't even know where to begin in talking about this. Oh, it's so good. We follow Yami as she starts at Catholic school in the rich white part of town after being outed at her last school. She's also having to keep an eye on her super smart brother who's going through a tough time and just acts out regularly. He gets quite violent. Yami is determined to stay in the closet at this school, but then she meets a girl who she quickly gets feelings for, and everything is just a lot more difficult than she was planning for it to be. This really isn't your sort of like typical light-hearted romance. This book does deal with some really heavy topics. You have homophobia, racism, suicide, but it just never quite gives in to the doom and gloom that it could be. I adored this book. Love from the Pink Palace by Jill Nalder. I've spoken about this one so much recently that you're probably all bored of hearing about it. But this is the true story behind Channel 4's It's a Sin, the TV show that made us all sob uncontrollably. And if you haven't watched it, then I beg you to do so ASAP. It is on Netflix. Netflix? Disney Plus. You can find it online. The character of Jill in the show was based on Jill Nalder, who after the success of It's a Sin decided to tell her own story in her own words. And whilst this does bear obvious resemblance to It's a Sin, the characters are really different. And the way Jill tells the story will just break your heart into a million pieces. This is the true story of how the AIDS epidemic affected the gay men of London and the West End. Just please listen to it, because a lot of these people who lived through this, they aren't around to tell their stories. The Appeal by Janice Hallett. Here it is, my number one mystery of this year. This is unlike anything I've ever read. This is a modern day epistolary novel told mostly through emails being exchanged by an amateur theatre group. And they're trying to fundraise for the granddaughter of one of the members who has cancer. And then another member turns up dead. There are a lot of characters here to keep track of, but they all have such distinctive voices in the emails that it's actually fairly easy to distinguish between all of them. But it does take a minute, but there is a handy list that you keep referring back to, and you get it eventually. The storyline here was just so intricately woven together. It was a genius bit of writing, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to track down another book that gives me the same vibes that this one did. So if you know of any books that are similar to The Appeal, let me know. When You Call My Name by Tucker Shaw. This is a very unlikely addition to this list. I had never heard anyone talking about this book when I came across it in my favourite bookshop, Gaze the Word on Marchmont Street in London. This is a story of two gay teenage boys in New York City. You've got Ben and Adam, who are on these very different paths. Ben is fashion obsessed, Adam's a film fanatic. Adam has fallen deeply in love with Callum, who it turns out is suffering with HIV/AIDS, whilst Ben is just out living his best life exploring the gay scene of this city. This is messy, it's powerful, it's a love letter to New York, it's a very delicate portrayal of the AIDS crisis and how it affected those in the community. I just thought this book was so beautifully written. The Stonewall Reader by the New York Public Library is an anthology featuring the stories of the real people who were there before, during, and after Stonewall. Each chapter is a different essay or interview with one of those people, and it was so fascinating to me how everyone seems to have a different recollection of what happened that day on Christopher Street with the Stonewall riots. It's just this perfect encapsulation of how history differs depending on who you ask, and as a queer history nerd, this was just a must-read for me. I would again highly recommend the audiobook of this one, just because many of the interviews are the actual audio recordings rather than the transcripts being read out by an unrelated narrator. It just really captures the people and the atmosphere of the time. And then we're coming into my top 3 books of the year. Number 3 is The Black Flamingo by Dean Atta, a novel told in verse about queer mixed race boy Michael, who's trying to find his place in a world where he never quite feels like he fits in. You begin with him as a young child and follow him all the way through to university, where he discovers the Black Flamingo, his drag queen alter ego. This is a celebration of youth, of queerness, of self-discovery. It's just wonderful. And again, I listened to the audiobook. Something about novels in verse on audiobooks, just hearing the poetry, can't beat it. Number 2 is I'm Glad My Mum Died by Jeanette McCurdy, which was one of my very first reads of the year, and I knew then that it was going to be one of my favourite books of the entire year. You've probably all heard of this by now, but it's by child star Jeanette McCurdy, about being a child actor in Hollywood and her deeply complex relationship with her mother, who was just this real stage mum. Jeanette beautifully writes about her trauma and her pain whilst never sort of like lingering too much on the past, focusing more about how she wants to move forward with what happened to her. It is really brutally honest, and despite the subject matter, it's actually really funny. Again, this is an audiobook recommendation. Jeanette herself narrates it, and I feel it really adds to the experience. Again, memoirs, when they're narrated by the actual person, you've got to listen to the audiobook. And finally, we come on to my number 1, my favourite book of 2023, and it was by a mile, Ondra and Santi Were Here by Johnny Garzavia. This is something really, really special, which I think you can tell just by looking at this cover alone. Like, you really can judge a book by its cover here, because it is just incredible, and the symbolism it has once you've read the book, it's amazing. In this, you have Onda, a non-binary Mexican-American teen artist who's inspired by the streets of San Antonio, where they've been born and bred. Then they meet Santi, the cute new waiter at their parents' taqueria. Everyone sort of like warns Onda and Santi to stay away, but there's just this undeniable connection between them, which is then complicated by the fact that Santi is an undocumented immigrant who could be ripped away at any moment. This is truly one of the most beautiful love stories I've ever read. It's so full of heartbreak and queer joy. There's a lot of upset in this book, but none of it's around the fact they're queer. The characters leapt off the page so much that I think about them every day. I just cannot recommend this one highly enough. And so there you go, there are all 60 books that I read in 2023, ranked from worst to best. Let me know if you agree or disagree with me on any of these books. What was your favourite book of the year? And also, what was your least favourite book of the year? I feel like that's much more juicy. Like, we're haters here at heart, we're haters. What was your least favourite book of 2023? Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you can stick around for 2024. If you're not subscribed, then please make sure you click that subscribe button. Like I said at the beginning, I've got some really exciting, fun things planned, and I can't wait to see what we can build this year. So come along the journey. Why not? I will see you in the next one. Bye, guys.